And now I'm talking to Hans Zomer, the director of Dóchas. Hans, how's it going? Hans, could you tell us, before we talk about the latest news, what's going on with Europe for the replacement to the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, could you tell us what's going on with the process now and has been for the last while, and it's going to happen up until 2015 in Europe and in Ireland, please?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that we're in the middle of a process to negotiate a new set of priorities for the global community. And Ireland is at the heart of this because at the moment Ireland is holding the EU presidency, which means that we get to influence some of these global processes. So a couple of years ago, the Ban Ki-moon, the UN leader, asked that member states and businesses and NGOs and everybody around the world should discuss, how would you set new priorities for global development? And that has led to a whole series of initiatives where people have debated and discussed and thought about, what is our priority for a better world? And one of those processes, I guess the main one, is at the UN level, where there's a high-level panel of sort of wise and important people that have been appointed by Ban Ki-moon to report to him and for a September summit in New York, which is going to set these new priorities.
I was talking to you for the first time a couple of months ago at the event in the RDS, organised by yourselves, Dóchas, Claiming Our Future and the Wheel. It was a discussion on what are the Irish public's thoughts as part of that process. So what's left in the process now over the next 2 years? What are the main steps left?
Well, we're coming towards the end of the process in that in September this UN summit will decide on the priorities. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've organised a number of events here in Ireland where we've asked Irish organisations and Irish people to set their priorities. We've now communicated those in writing and physically to leaders around Europe because, as I said, the Ireland is holding the EU presidency, so we had a reason and an excuse, if you will, to write to ministers across the 27 EU member states. And we have said, well, the results of the discussions that in Ireland were, the following priorities, and essentially those priorities are quite similar to what you're hearing from civil society organizations around the world. And they are about, the people are worried about the growing inequalities in societies and between countries, that people are wondering whether governments are really listening to them and responding to their needs. They are worried about the damage we're doing to the environment and whether that's going to impact on our lifestyles and our ability to feed ourselves. They are worried about whether the economy that we have is actually delivering benefits for people rather than just for multinationals. So those are the issues that are coming up here in Ireland, and they're coming up internationally. And we have now brought all those together and said, well, the Irish organizations think this, European NGOs very much are on the same line, and we have communicated those priorities to the government ministers. So the EU is at the moment taking that in and trying to arrive at a negotiation mandate for the summit in September. There's been a meeting in May by the development ministers. There'll be another meeting in June by the foreign affairs ministers and the environment ministers, and all those positions will come together as an EU input, if you will, into the negotiations in September in New York.
In September in New York, it'll be announced what's going to replace the Millennium Development Goals.
I don't know. Ireland is actually, again, very much at the heart of this because Ireland is co-hosting that summit together with South Africa. So we get to set that agenda, or the Irish government does. I suspect it's not the end of the line. I suspect what will happen in September is that the UN will say, well, we'll need another year to really make sure that we all agree on these priorities. I think the September summit will indicate the direction in which that discussion is going, but I don't think it will actually make the decision. So we'll probably have another year to influence that process after September 2013.
And it's very important that the Millennium Development Goals that started in 2000 up to 2015, we don't forget about those, are they? And the reason I'm talking to you today is because it's been talk in the last week. There was an important meeting, maybe you could tell us about that, I think it was on Tuesday in Brussels, and it was very important, and it was a lot of good work done. But there's a danger that the work of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, particularly the target of all governments in the EU having 0.7% of our GNP spent on development aid, will not be achieved. Is that possible?
Absolutely, yeah. We were also quite shocked that earlier this week, as you said, the EU ministers adopted conclusions. And the text, if you read it, it's all very good. They are setting, the right tone. They're quite ambitious. They are saying we need to be able to eradicate extreme poverty within the next generation. So that means there's an urgency there. And the Millennium Development Goals were very, very good at establishing that urgency. And one of the things that we as rich countries have promised is that we will help achieve those Millennium Development Goals by resourcing it. And that means coming up with the cash to basically deliver on all those lofty promises that we have made. And now we are seeing that actually, despite the language that the ministers agreed on, when you actually asked the individual EU member states, well, how much are you going to spend on overseas aid, that they're either trying to avoid the question or certainly not delivering the promise that they've made, which is that they will spend 0.7% of their national wealth on overseas aid. So 70 cents out of every 100 euros they have. That's the target they have set. That's the target they set for themselves, 13 years ago, and they still haven't delivered on it. And judging from this week, it sounds like they are in no hurry to try and deliver on it and keep their promise.
And is there a danger that, I read somewhere that the money we spend in Ireland, that the Irish government through Irish Aid spends, it's just under 0.5%, 0.05% of our GNP. That could be reduced instead of being increased. Is that true?
Yeah, this is what we saw on Tuesday, that basically the EU member states had been asked to give an indication of how much they are going to be spending on overseas aid. And the Irish government has always, or at least since in the last couple of years, said that our target was 0.7. Now, in recent years, they said, well, at least the target should be to hold the aid program at 0.5%, which is where we're at the moment. But the figures that they have submitted to the European Commission actually shows that they intend to go down to 0.44%. Now, percents don't mean an awful lot to ordinary people like you and me, but I think it's most dramatically explained that basically, if we are following that time frame and that plan that the Irish government has now given to the EU, we will be falling short 259 million euros on what we said we would spend.
Yeah, could we just talk about, we'll come back to that in a minute, could we just talk about Irish aid for a minute? And I read recently someone say, I don't know if it's true, on the internet I think it was, on some forum, saying that the most of the money, or a lot of the money that Irish aid give to developing countries goes to those governments, and the governments spend it. Is that true? Is the money that Irish aid gives to developing countries accountable, basically,
Yeah, there's different, basically as a rule of thumb, you can sort of say that about a third of what we spend on overseas aid is going to other countries, other governments. About a third is going to multilateral organizations like the EU and the World Bank and the UN. And then about a third is going through NGOs, so the charities that your listeners are supporting. So there's different channels for each of those. We, of course, said, well, that the money being spent through development NGOs is some of the most effective because it's going directly to very poor and very vulnerable communities. We're also saying it's important that not all of that money goes through NGOs because, for development to take off, you do need governments. So you do need to invest in the capacity of governments. So it's good that about a third of the Irish aid is going through bilateral programs, through other governments. And there is a certain element of risk in there. Of course there is. But I think that overall, the checks and balances and the monitoring of the Irish aid program is very, very good. In fact, I think I for no trouble saying it's probably among the best in the world, and it's probably among the best in Ireland, because I think the way the overseas aid spending is being monitored is not being matched by the way we're controlling and monitoring our spending by government here domestically. So overall, the Irish aid program is very accountable. Everybody can see where it's gone. There's annual reports. There's annual reports by the controller or auditor. There's annual debates in the Oireachtas. It's all up there on the web for people to see. So, and if they have questions about the aid program, get in touch with Irish Aid and ask them, or get in touch to your local TD and get him or her to ask.
I saw talking about the Millennium Development Goals up until 2015 again for a minute. I saw Gay Mitchell made a speech in the EU Parliament there a couple of days ago talking about this, that what came out of the meeting the other day as regards the Millennium Development Goals not being reached in terms of 0.7%. If listeners want to play a part in encouraging the EU and Irish politicians to be proactive on this, to make a difference, to have an effect, what do you recommend is the best thing they do?
Well, the best thing to do is to be heard, because we know that 8 out of every 10 people in Ireland support overseas aid, but there tends to be a quiet majority. And what we would like people to do is to get in touch with their MEPs or with their TDs, and that's very easy these days with the email. You go onto the TD's website or go onto the actnow2015.ie website and log in there, or find your local TD and you can send an email. It's already there for you. But essentially, it's about making our leaders and our politicians know that we care. That is a really important thing to do. It's not a very difficult thing to do, but it is, let's not give politicians the excuse that they can say, oh, well, our voters don't care. We know they do. We just have to encourage them to actually make that known.